Welcome, everyone. It's Eli Weber with Rachel Weber Leshaw, and we're going to talk about
Charoset,
which is in the Mishnah and in the Gemara.
And yet, it's really a secondary player. It doesn't get like one of the simanim of Leil Haseder. So I want to talk about sort of why it exists. If you ask like a kid, right, what does Charoset represent? What's the answer? It looks like the
Mortar.
Good. What's mortar? It's the stuff that you put between bricks. I guess that's cement, but some thick, squishy thing, right? That's what they say. That's one of the opinions in the Gemara. The Gemara asks, what does the Charoset represent? One is it represents the mortar, but there's also a different opinion. The other opinion is it's supposed to be made out of apples to remind us of the apples of Yetziat Mitzrayim. Now, this is based on a midrash in the Gemara in Sota and other places that talks about the women in Mitzrayim who were so insistent on continuing Jewish life in Mitzrayim that even when their husbands were out working in the fields, they would make sure that they would come together to create new Jewish life and continue to have babies. Now, what does that have to do with Charoset and bringing it into the Seder? So I have a theory that I think is borne out. Most of the foods at Leil Haseder are either shibud foods or geula foods, slavery or freedom, right? For slavery, we got
matzah.
Right. Well, matzah might also be freedom, but fine. We got maror, we got dalid koso, which represents geula, and then we have charoset, which we eat alongside with the maror. And there's this really interesting question: where does charoset fall on the shibud to geula scale? Right. It represents the mortar, the physical labor that Jewish slaves were doing in Mitzrayim, but it also represents a story about optimism during Mitzrayim, during the slavery. It represents this story of women who insisted that there was going to be a Jewish future. And so we do this sort of funny thing, right? Charoset doesn't get its own time in the Seder, but we put it in with the maror. And then we put it in korech, when we take matzah and we take maror and we take a little bit of charoset, and we think about how we would have had the Korban Pesach. And we say that, like, actually that dichotomy, right, of shibud to geula, it's not 100% like chronological. It's not 100% we were slaves and then we were free. To get from slavery to freedom, we needed to have some sense during the slavery that freedom might be just around the corner.
So it's the transition?
I don't think it's the transition. I actually think it's reminding us that during the maror stage, there were always some people who knew that it wasn't always going to be maror, right? That at the same time, there were just maybe a few people holding on to that idea.
I think we think the same thing about matzah to a certain extent. And maybe even that matzah transitions during the Seder from halach ma'anya, this is the bread of affliction, to a sense of geula. When I was a little kid, I went shopping with your grandfather, my father, Zichron Livracha, and got a Haggadah, and it had this English story, which I still tell over, and I think is really fantastic. This person was very poor, and he met his college friend or whatever, who was very, very rich, and he used to live in rags, and they had nothing, and he said, why don't you move to my estate, and I'll give you a house, I'll give you clothing, and all that's great. And every year on the anniversary that he met his friend, he would dress up in rags, and his kids would see him, and they'd be all excited because they're going to get gifts, and it's going to be a party, and it's going to be a celebration. And then one day, sadly, he had a big fight with his friend. His friend kicked him out. All he had left was his rags. His kids saw him, and they thought, this is the day. And he said, no, it used to be, it was kehalach ma'anya, but now it's actually halach ma'anya. And to a certain extent, the Rambam says, we're going through the process, and sometimes matzah represents shibud, and sometimes matzah represents geula. And if you're right, and it seems like it is, there's something in between that you can't put your finger on, but it represents the process that we're going through in Mitzrayim, at Leil HaSeder, from the shibud to the geula. Now,
Can I say one last piece?
Of course.
One of the successes of Leil HaSeder, but also something that makes it challenging, is that we break things down into this very ordered thing. We do our matzah, then we do our maror, then we do our korech, then we eat, and then we have afikomen at the end, which theoretically represents the Korban Pesach. On an ideal level, these things would be happening sort of together, so that what you would be eating is a sandwich that represents everything, right? And maybe korech is that, although again, it also sort of comes too early. I think that that's one of the educational things that we need to be thinking about, which is how do we identify each symbol as what it carries, but also realize that Leil HaSeder is the sandwich of all of those things together.
completely. Chag kasher v'sameach to all.
Thanks for joining us.